All right, good morning, good evening, everyone. We're gonna give folks a couple more minutes here to join us on this virtual community meeting for the Crystal City Bike Network. But we will be underway here very soon. All right. Once again, good evening, everyone. Welcome to this virtual community meeting hosted by Arlington County Department of Environmental Services, Division of Transportation. This public meeting is about the Crystal City Bike Network, and we're going to get started here right now. I'm going to introduce myself first, along with members of the project team. We're going to sort of wave to you from our videos here. My name is Nate Graham. I'm a public engagement specialist with the Division of Transportation. And I'm joined tonight.
Hi everybody, and I'm Dan Neighbors with Transportation Engineering and Operations as part of DES.
Hi everybody, my name is Leah Gerber. I'm a principal planner with Transportation Planning in DES.
Hi everyone, my name is Joanne Gabor and I am with DES as well.
Hey everyone, I'm Kevin Cassidy. I'm with DS under the Transportation Engineering and Operations design team.
I'm Erin Potter with the public engagement team. We'll send it back to Nate.
All right, so we will be taking you through this presentation and then into Q&A for this evening's meeting. As a quick reminder for those of you who might be new to the Teams Live platform, here's a meeting agenda. We'll start with covering the background and origin of the project, challenges and opportunities as part of the analysis for the bike network, the alternatives that were considered by staff and the project team, a recommended bike network that we are putting forth for your consideration, some next steps, and then our question and answer period. And now we will remind you how to use the Teams Live platform. You see right here on your screen, you can enter a question at any time during this presentation by clicking on the little question mark here on the side. I will make an announcement here. That you can find it. We will be taking these questions and confirming that we've received them and getting them ready for the Q&A period at the end of this presentation. But feel free to submit them at any time. So you can see here, you can see where the button is and where your question goes as you watch the presentation. So without further ado, we'll move on to the project background here. I'm going to hand this over to Leah Gerber.
Great, thank you, Nate. So just to start off, I'll give some background and origins of Crystal City itself, and starting off with transportation context. So Crystal City is a high density area, meaning it has lots of buildings, people, and also ways to get around. So rather than just thinking of the bike network by itself, we're looking at it in a larger network of transportation options. So how can residents or commuters bike and ride the bus or take the metro and then hop on Capital Bike Share? So from this list, you can see how many transportation resources are in Crystal City. And while this is a challenge, it's also an opportunity to create a multimodal network. Okay, thank you. So one slide back. Anyway, so we'll provide some project background on this. So essentially, there's some language here from a county board resolution. This was from about a year ago in March 2020. This is from the county board and the county manager's office. They directed the Department of Environmental Services, or DES, to investigate options for enhancing the bike network in Crystal City within the next 4 years. And you can see some of the exact language here, and it focuses on the first outcome, a network of enhanced bike facilities such as protected and buffered bike lanes, as well as the where. So the network will be focused east of Richmond Highway from the Alexandria border extending north to Long Bridge Park. And this also includes, considering trade-offs within the right-of-way. And you can see in that last bullet point, it mentioned a 4-year timeline with implementation occurring by the end of 2024. And so this directive was a result of a few factors which are reflected in the requirements. So the first major requirement is transit. There are plans to enhance the north-south Crystal City Potomac Yard Transitway, and there will likely be a lane dedicated to transit. And so just to give some background on that, the transitway currently provides direct service along the Route 1 corridor between Braddock Road Metro Station in Alexandria all the way to Pentagon City. So it's currently the only local bus service which provides this connection to neighborhoods east and west along the corridor. So how can we make a bike network that functions in a way that's complementary to this existing transitway as well as an enhanced transitway? The second requirement is balancing the needs for all modes. So at this point, we're trying to make sure, bikes, pedestrians, transit, the businesses who require pickup and drop off, loading and parking, how can they all have their needs met? The third requirement includes aligning with guiding planning documents, and I'll get to those in a minute. And the final requirement is to coordinate the bike network with redevelopment, including Amazon's HU2 and other redevelopment projects. So when looking at these concepts for a bike network, the county integrated all of these requirements together to create a network that integrates transit and all the factors that I mentioned, as well as the stakeholders in Crystal City. And so here are some of the plans that I mentioned. There's really two for Crystal City. So the first is that Crystal City Sector Plan from 2010, and this really focused on comprehensive bicycle and pedestrian networks, as well as being really focused on trails. So the plan specifically mentions trail connections from Crystal Drive to Long Bridge Park, as well as from 4 Mile Run Trail to Crystal City and Potomac Yard. The second document is the bike element, and that's the map with the blue and the red. And that's from the Master Transportation Plan 2019. And this really focuses on improving the bike network in Crystal City, and it's a little more specific than the sector plan and takes development into account. So you can see this planning map from the bike element that I mentioned. It focuses on upgrading existing bike lanes on Potomac Ave and Crystal Drive, as well as providing a lower stress route linking Crystal City to existing trails, green space, and to Pentagon City. And when I say low stress route, that just means a bike route that the average bicyclist would feel comfortable using. And so next I'll talk about the benefits. So here are some benefits and opportunities to creating a connected bike network in Crystal City. So there's increased safety, access to trail connections like the Mount Vernon and Potomac Yard Trail, and reduced bike lane blocking. So sometimes delivery trucks or other vehicles can inadvertently block bike lanes, and it makes it really difficult for cyclists. So the bike network is a great opportunity to address an issue that cyclists experience in Crystal City. And you can see there's a few other improvements and opportunities as well. So I'll go ahead and pass it over to Dan to discuss some of the challenges.
Hey, thanks, Leah. Leah went over the scope, really illustrating that we're trying to get something done within the next 4 years because we see that there's a need out, on the streets in Crystal City. Leah also talked about some of the existing and planned transit facilities, the transitway, and the fact that it provides that critical link, or will provide that critical link between the Braddock Road Metro and Pentagon City Metro and a lot of the development that's occurring in the area. This is how a lot of people get around between these areas. Some of the other challenges are there's a lot of underground utilities in Crystal City, which really constrains, how much we can do with moving curbs and whatnot. Development schedules, there's clearly a lot of development occurring in Crystal City as well. And that is something that is on its own timeline. It's something that we don't necessarily have control of. But we'll show you through the rest of the presentations how we're trying to capitalize on some of the development that may be occurring. Again, limited right-of-way is very similar to the underground utilities and some of the constraints. A lot of Crystal City was built a while ago before some of the newer facilities and multimodal facilities were really updated as to the extent that they are now. And so that kind of limits what we can do moving forward to some extent. And then, of course, the last need really is for us to deliver this network improvement within that board required timeline, that 4-year timeline. So that means a lot of the capital improvements would be outside of that 4-year window.
So here we're going to start discussing some of the options we examined for a potential bike lane network.
Yep.
Got it. Got that microphone sorted, Dan?
Yep. Thank you.
Yes, sir.
So here's the 4 options, like Nate just described. The first is northbound and southbound bike lanes on Crystal Drive, which is pretty much what's out there right now. The second option that we'll discuss is a 2-way cycle track on the east side of Crystal Drive. So that's on the side where you have the water park, and it's on the northbound lane side of the street. Option 3 is the west side of Crystal Drive, where you have more of the restaurants and other eating establishments. And then Option 4 is a southbound protected bike lane on Crystal Drive. Again, that's the side that is close to those restaurants. And then a northbound contraflow protected bike lane on Clark Bell. A contraflow lane just really means it's a lane that goes against the vehicle traffic stream. So the vehicle traffic goes southbound on Clark Bell, but the protected bike lane would go northbound. And we'll talk about that in more detail in a moment. Okay, let's see if I can advance. All right, so a little bit more about option 1. You can see on the graphic here to the right, this is basically what we're talking about with option 1, is if we go from right to left, you'll see that there's a bike lane, then you have your bus lane, you have a vehicle travel lane, you have your two-way left turn lane, then another vehicle lane, bicycle lane, and a parking lane. And this is pretty much what's out there right now. So that is obviously something that would be feasible within that 4-year time frame. You do maintain a lot of the curb extensions that are out on the roadway, and those are seen as a benefit to pedestrians. The disadvantages, of course, it really doesn't address the issues with regard to bicycling on Crystal Drive. So as a result, it's not recommended because it doesn't really address those issues. Okay. Option 2 is the two-way cycle track on the east side of Crystal Drive. And again, I'll refer to the graphic here and walk you through what that is. So the east side, again, is adjacent to the northbound lanes, but there would be a cycle track where bicyclists would be able to bike in both directions, then a buffer, then you have your transit lane, you have a northbound vehicle lane, your two-way left turn lane where people can make their left turns, and then you would have a southbound travel vehicle lane. The good thing about this is that it does provide separated facilities in both directions, and when you're comparing the east side versus the west side for a two-way cycle track, there's less driveways and conflict points on the east side. The disadvantages is that it requires people that are using transit to get on and get off of the bus in the cycle track. You can see here, this space, this 3-foot buffer isn't enough and doesn't meet with ADA compliance in terms of providing that boarding space for pedestrians to get on and off the bus. And so people would be boarding and alighting in the cycle track, which is one of those negative things. It also requires the loss of all on-street parking and pickup and drop-off in this scenario, just to provide that sufficient width to incorporate this 10 to 11 foot two-way cycle track. It also would require the removal of the curb extensions to get that full width that is needed to accommodate this cross-section. And if you look at the graphic below, I'll hover my cursor around that, you can kind of see what I'm trying to describe here. So the cycle track in this aerial view, again, is on the right side. So that's on the east side of the bike lane, of the street. In order to accommodate vehicles turning into that one southbound lane, you have to remove these curb extensions in order for people to be able to make that maneuver without encroaching into the other lanes. Another way to look at this is that southbound lane, as described in this scenario, is basically occupying the space where you have the existing parking lane and biking lane. So instead of parking and bicyclists against the curb, you'd have vehicles driving against that curb. And because that you're kind of switching the parking and biking lane, the existing parking and biking lane, to this vehicular travel lane, it requires a shift in the alignment of all of the lanes on the street. So there is a significant lane realignment that would have an impact too, and a cost associated with that. Other costs that would be associated with this is not only just the infrastructure changes, but I did mention that there is a lot of utilities, and very often we have signals and other things located on those corners, so that would greatly increase the cost of this option as well. So ultimately, the result is it's not recommended, it's not feasible within the project implementation timeline because of some of these constraints and costs. There would be significant impacts to the transitway and for passengers of the transitway due to the conflicts between transit riders and bicyclists and substantial capital requirements. So again, not recommended at this time. Let's see if I can go to option 3. There we go. Option 3 is a two-way cycle track on the west side of the roadway. So again, I'll just walk you through what it would look like going from right to left. You have your transit way on that going northbound against the curb, northbound vehicle lane, your two-way left turn lane for turning vehicles. You have a southbound vehicle lane, buffer, and then you have your two-way cycle track. So the advantages is that you get that two-way protected facility. You do have major lane realignment here as well, because basically you're taking what I described before is against this curb on the left side, you have your existing parking and bicycle lane, and you're converting that into 2 bicycle lanes with a buffer. Disadvantages is that requires changes to the traffic signals, because basically what you're doing is you have more conflict points on the west side of the roadway. That's where your intersections are, and that's where a lot of your driveways are. So at the intersections, you'd have to have traffic signals. If you're familiar with the Army-Navy Drive cycle track, that's a large capital project where there's complete signal rebuilds associated with that cycle track to mitigate those conflict points. Similar to the previous option, it would also have the loss of all existing parking and a pickup drop-off. There's high risk of conflicts at intersections and driveways because there's more of them on that side like I described. It does not meet many of the fire access requirements, and that's fire access to the buildings and other requirements aren't met through this. There are some alignment challenges, but not as significant as in the previous scenario. And I'll just describe one of those challenges here on this graphic below. You can see, again, very similar to what we described before, is you have issues with vehicles trying to turn right into that one southbound lane. It's not the same extent as the previous scenario, but some of the problems that you'd have, you can kind of see if I'm tracing this path of a vehicle turning right, and it's in this green shaded area. With the way that that vehicle would turn, it would require, of course, removal of some of the curb extension in order to get that 10 to 11 foot cycle track, but it also requires your bicyclists to stop well beyond the sight lines of the intersection just so vehicles can make those turns. So the stop would have to be basically where that arrow is pointing. So again, there would be significant costs in within this 4-year timeline because some of these alignment challenges and some of these construction requirements. So ultimately, this was not recommended, infeasible within that project implementation timeline due to those impacts on the commercial streetscape with adjacent to those commercial developments and the substantial capital requirements, and also some of the challenges that we'd see with access from the fire code. Okay. So the fourth option we came up with is a southbound protected bike lane on Crystal Drive. Very similar to some of the previous scenarios, but I'll just note what it's a one-way southbound cycle track. You can see against the west side of the roadway going southbound. Then you have a buffered space, and then you have your parking lane / pickup drop off, and then you have your vehicle, southbound vehicle lanes. Then you, of course, the rest is kind of similar to the other scenarios, but what benefit this provides is it separates the bicyclists from the moving through traffic. It's a coupled one-way pair design, so you'd be able to go southbound in this protected facility along Crystal Drive, but then on Clark Bell, you'd be able to go northbound in a protected facility. What that would look like going from right to left is you have your bicycle lane, you'd have a buffer space, you'd have your parking lane, then a southbound vehicle lane, and a southbound transit lane, and then parking. So again, there's that separation that is between the moving vehicle lanes and the bicycle lanes. The other advantage of this is that it's feasible with minimal changes to the curb line. Disadvantages are minimum travel widths, but again, these are things that we've dealt with in some of the protected bike lane implementations that we've done throughout the county and other locations. And then it does, another disadvantage is that the one-way pair facilities does provide protected paths along those one-way pairs, southbound on Crystal Drive and northbound on Clark Bell, but there is less direct paths in general because of that. So the result is recommended for implementation. It is feasible within the 4-year time frame. It meets the county board's direction, and it maintains multimodal priorities for the area. That seems to be stuck for me. Thank you. So a little bit more detail about this option 4, which is the recommended option. North-south, you have the one-way pair, and you can kind of see the arrows here going southbound on Crystal Drive and northbound on Clark Bell. That's the one-way pair we're talking about. So those are the protected facilities. On east-west, we're proposing improvements at 15th, 18th, 23rd, and 26th Street, which we'll talk about in a little bit more detail, but that's working with some of the capital projects and some of our developers and potential projects to realize some of those improvements. Okay. Yeah, I don't seem to have control here. That's Nate, thank you. So the cross sections that I showed you for the southbound protected bike lane here on this top graphic, the bottom graphic is the northbound contraflow lane. Those are basically in these sections of Crystal Drive. Right here you can see the highlighted section in blue, and then the highlighted section on Clark Bell. Those are the sections where you see that protection on that north-south pair. Some other details of that north-south pair is some other facilities would come into play, like the multi-use trail, the Clark Bell connector right here. That's something that would provide a more complete network. And you can see over here, off to the right on Crystal Drive, we have standard bike lanes in that section due to limitations in space. But that section right there connects directly to the Crystal City connector, which goes to the Mount Vernon Trail. Okay, next. And we'll talk a little bit more about some of these cross-street connections, because that's what really provides the key to making this successful, so that you can make it in these one-way protected pairs. And for that, I'll turn it over to Kevin to describe that. Kevin?
Thanks, Dan. So I'm going to go ahead and start up on the north side at 15th Street South. So this project is currently being developed by capital improvement project, along with site plan and a parks project. We've been working with them in order to enhance the proposed facility, in order to connect into what's already being improved at 15th and Eads. So that current protected intersection design and buffered bike lanes will continue on through the majority of 15th Street, tying into Crystal Drive. There is a section of Crystal Drive that's already been built, that 15th and Crystal Drive on that southwest corner, where there's already driveways and loading onto the site. So that small location is going to remain standard and or buffered bike lanes. But on the north curb, which is the westbound bike lane, we're looking at implementing a bike lane with a raised buffered median. And then in the eastbound direction, for that first portion, it would be a protected bike lane that transitions into that buffered or standard bike lane. Heading down to 18th Street South. The original plan for this was to have 2 lanes in each direction with standard bike lanes through also site developments. We've been working with them, and in order to get in the standard bike, the partially protected and the buffered bike lane, we were able to drop one of the lanes in the westbound direction for a portion of the block in order to open up that space to create those either the buffer or the protection. As that gets closer towards Bell Street, we still need to accommodate additional turn movements, and it's a transit way, and it's also the location to the metro entrance. So we've got a lot of conflict intersecting and needs at that intersection. So we're just trying to prioritize or allocate space to all the different modes on that design. Heading down to 20th Street. So this block is currently only going through a partial redevelopment. The midsection of 20th Street still stays pretty constrained. It's only 1 lane in each direction. So there isn't much of an opportunity in the short term for us to further enhance what's already out there. There is some redeveloping going on, which you can see it on coming off of Clark Street. There's that portion of orange or yellow, which is a portion of the protected bike lanes that will go in with that site that will tie back into 20th Street. In the interim, until that site's built, that contraflow bike lane will just transition to a shadowed eastbound lane. As I mentioned, it's only a single lane in the eastbound direction, so there isn't much room to change that in the short term. Going down to 23rd Street, this block is being essentially completely redesigned, once again, between a capital project and also a site plan. We've been working with them in order to provide protected bike lanes through the entire section, and also we're looking at incorporating some partial protected intersections where the space allows us to. It also does maintain a median in the center because there is currently a mid-block crossing on 23rd Street. So we'd like to provide that space for that median cut through. The section does change a little bit as it gets closer to Richmond Highway, because to accommodate all the different turn movements, it does drop out to a buffered and or standard bike lane at the intersection. Some of that's still being designed based on the traffic patterns. And the last part to that would be 26th Street. We looked at this as the kind of the first piece coming off of Crystal Drive if you're heading in the northbound direction. In order to allow more easy access to that northbound contraflow, we looked at removing the parking along the north side in order to create a buffered bike lane to allow for that westbound connection.
All right, so I'm going to take over here from Kevin and talk through our next steps for the Crystal City Bike Network public engagement. As you know, the virtual community meeting is occurring now. And tonight we're actually going to walk you through an online engagement form using the Conveo tool, which will launch shortly, and Aaron Potter will walk you through how to use that. That form will be open until March 14th at 11:59 p.m. It's a pretty unique tool. I think it has some really cool features that allow us to really sort of delve into the details on what each segment of the bikeway network that we are recommending can look like, and then bring that in for the ability to comment directly on some of the locations. So that will go through March 14th. There will be a second community meeting later this spring to share what we heard from that community forum, as well as an updated design for the bikeway network based on the feedback we received. And that will conclude with the selection of a preferred alternative for implementation, which will go before the county board for action later in 2021. So with that, I have received a number of questions, so we are going to move to the question and answer portion of this with the team here. Give me a few seconds here. I know we just got about 6 more questions in that I haven't had a chance to respond to. So let me get those lined up so that our team is able to prepare for them. Let's go here. Why don't I set up a couple of questions first, and while those are being answered, I'll get everything else sorted out. So we had a question from Darren that I'm going to direct to Dan and Leah. Darren asked if a project isn't feasible within the 4-year timeline, and the 4-year timeline here is for this bike network as directed by the board, and the project isn't called for in any other plan, it will not happen, correct?
Yeah, and I'll start with that, Nate. Part of why we were gravitating towards a 4-year time frame is to recognize the need for doing something immediately based off of the conditions that we're all aware of out there. You know, you have different modes that are blocking the bike lanes. We have a lot of activity. From all modes, we have a lot of pedestrians, and so we see a need to balance things within that 4-year time frame rather than, you know, taking a longer time. You know, I'll use Army Navy Drive similarly, you know, to go through a longer process to build something out the way it should be. We see that a need to do something in the short term and the ability to do something in the short term to make some substantive improvements. So that's kind of why we're focused on that 4-year time frame. And I'll let Leah kind of chime in about opportunities beyond that.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. From a planning standpoint, you know, there's a very clear timeline for the 4 years, and we are considering, you know, things beyond that. When you think about capital improvement projects, those can go out, you know, 10 years in advance. So we're keeping an eye on approved development projects and other development sites that may redevelop in the future, but there's not a specific document beyond 2024. So ultimately we'll be guided by the MTP bike element in the Crystal City sector plan for now.
All right, thanks guys. We're going to go to our second question here from user PVH. Plans for Army Navy Drive include a cycle track on the south side and then a bus lane with an exit pad for the bus. Can this be done on Crystal Drive? And I'll send that over to Dan and Kevin.
Okay. Yeah.
I can go ahead and take that one. So the plans on Army Navy Drive actually allowed them to reduce the total number of lanes and actually build out the cycle track and condense the how many travel lanes they need in each direction. So what that allowed them to do is actually build a floating bus island between the cycle track and the bus lanes, and that allows them to you know, board and onboard and offboard people without being in the bike lane. That buffer also continues. It does narrow and get wider in certain places, but at the locations where they needed the bus stops, they were able to provide for those floating islands.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that, Kevin, in that, a lot of the other plans we have in Crystal City, some of the recent developments like that park have this floating bus island concept too. The requirements for the American with Disabilities Act of 1990 requires that landing for pedestrians to safely board and alight has to be 8 feet in width. So on Army Navy Drive, like Kevin was talking about, we're able to, by taking out lanes, able to provide that 8 feet of width. Unfortunately, on Crystal Drive, we don't have 8 feet of width to spare in order to provide that sufficient landing.
All right, thank you guys for that. I'm going to move on to our next question here, which was from Darren. Darren asked, why did you choose to provide a substandard bike lane on Crystal Drive in option 4, but widen the general purpose lanes? For Kevin and Dan.
Okay, I'll start with this. The proposal is to provide basically protected bike lanes in one direction. So I'm not sure if that was what is seen as substandard, but again, by pairing those protected facilities, we provide kind of a network option for bicyclists to navigate both Crystal Drive and Clark Bell. Those connecting streets we know are important, and those are things that we've heard through some engagement in the past, to have those as substantial as possible so that you can make that connection between those two one-way pairs, if you will. So we recognize that it's not bike lanes in both directions, but it is an enhanced facility which we see as an immediate need, and that's why we're proposing it.
Okay.
And I think the other part to that was the widths of the travel lanes and proposed in the options. These are the sections that we put together are kind of typical sections, and where we say 5 and 3 or 11, that isn't the exact width that it will be on the entire quarter. There are places where that will be pinched, and 11 will be 10.5 and 3 will be 2.9. So there's a lot more engineering that needs to go into those, and it's just kind of your typical cross sections that we looked at.
Okay, thanks Kevin, thanks again. I'm gonna move to too many windows. A question seeking further comment from Stephen R. Curious to hear staff's thoughts on the travel lane widths on Crystal Drive. Option 2 shows 11-foot general lanes, but could those shrink to limit needed curb modifications for that option? I'll send that over to Dan.
Yeah, and I think that's similar to our previous response. Again, the challenge that we have on all the streets is they're not a uniform width. So that means, these are just typical sections, but yes, we do go down to 10-foot lanes in many occasions for vehicle lanes. We keep 11-foot lanes for bus lanes, however, but for vehicle lanes, we can, in certain conditions, go down to 10 feet. That's correct.
And then I just want to add to that is we also we look at what is adjacent to the travel lanes too. So if we're right up against the curb, generally we like to stay closer to the 11-foot widths. We've had issues in several locations where if we go down to the minimums and it's right up against the curb and gutter, it can have issues, and it also does make the turning movements into those lanes more difficult. So you have impacts at the intersections.
Okay, thank you, Kevin. I'm going to try and combine a couple of questions that are similar here. So we have a question from PBH. Why does Clark Bell have 2 parking lanes? And then a question from Rob Mandel at the National Landing Bid. The western side of South Clark Street between 23rd and 20th has no sidewalk. How will they, and I presume they is parking users, exit and cross the street? Could that 7-foot of parking aisle proposed there be shifted to the east to create a 2-way facility? Could that be a safer outcome?
So I'll go ahead and start with this one too. So the 7-foot parking on both sides only is in a section of Clark Bell. It's the section that's south of 23rd. It eventually turns into a wider sidewalk and a bus stop. North of 23rd, there are some bus stops on the west side where there are crossings. And in order to get in the contraflow lane, the angled parking had to be turned into parallel parking. But that section will not have parking on both sides. We just wanted to try to keep the overall view a little bit more simplified and show what kind of the typical section would look like. There are places where the parking doesn't exist, though.
Okay, thanks, Kevin. Appreciate that. All right, let's see here. We are getting a lot of questions. We're getting a lot of very detailed questions. So Kevin and Dan, I'm going to keep you busy here. This is a good broader question, I think, which could be helpful for Dan and Leah to weigh in on. Dana asks, how would these changes, how would the proposed, let's say, recommended network be impacted if the US Route 1 at grading initiative moves forward?
So I'll start that. Basically, we've kind of taking that into consideration, what we're looking at. So largely this proposal works. There might be some areas where on the cross streets that there might be some change based off of that, the outcome of that study. And that's, perhaps just confined to 15th Street. But again, I think for the most part, we've taken that in consideration, and most of this would still be viable, with maybe the exception of 15th Street, because we don't know what the outcome of that study is. But there are enhancements that are being done on 15th Street as part of Met Park that, again, we're trying to kind of keep that, we have a fully protected intersection plan at 15th and Eads, and improvements going east. And so we're trying to see if we can kind of keep those improvements moving farther east beyond Route 1. So the intent is to deliver what we're proposing right now. That does fit in with other plans. But again, we just don't know the outcome of the study. But that's a good question.
Thanks, Dan. All right, let's see where we are here. A question from Tom, and I'm going to direct this to Kevin. Why is the full length of Crystal Drive not being upgraded to a protected bike lane?
Sorry about that for a sec. I lost the button to unmute. So I can kind of try to split this up a little bit. So we looked at, we didn't look at south of 23rd because the current cross section there is too constrained without additional site development going on. So depending on how that plays out, there might be the ability to extend that farther, but it's kind of outside of what we can determine in the 4-year timeline at this point. So it's not something we can include in this plan. And then there's that section that's north of 18th connecting to 15th. So that there's kind of two portions to that one. One, we see the need to keep the northbound lanes on Crystal Drive throughout that section because it does act as a connection coming out of the trails on the east side of Crystal Drive, and that you would need to be able to access that whether you came from 18th Street eastbound heading onto Crystal Drive, or if you were coming out of the trail and wanted to continue northbound to 15th Street to access either the trails of the Clark Bell extension or the trails further down on Crystal Drive. So there's that portion of it, and then also some of those site plans had already been pre-approved years before this, and moving towards that kind of those sections. So we kind of had to work within the given cross section at the time.
Thanks, Kevin. All right, let's see here. So a question about the 18th Street section from Rob Mandel, National Landing bid again. Previous county plans for the 18th Street section included a right-hand turn to head north on Clark Bell. As I recall, the need was questioned by all. I'm not sure the venue for that questioning, but is this still included in the vision for an updated 18th Street South, the right-hand turn lane?
So this is getting down a little bit into the details of everything. As far as I know, that right turn pocket is still being planned for in the short term. And I believe that came out of a discussion of needing to provide that because of the heavy use of PEDs on that crosswalk because of the metro entrance. There have been discussions on whether or not that could be removed once the other metro entrance is constructed, and then essentially just continue the bike lane straight through that area. It does have some impact on that, and then I guess Joanne, you're also involved in that, so maybe you can clarify.
Thank you, Kevin. Again, this is Joanne Gabor. Rob, I do remember all those conversations. As Kevin said, currently we are maintaining that right turn lane. And I think what's going to happen is, as Kevin mentioned, once the second metro entrance is completed, once that park area is completed, once the entire north area of 18th Street is redeveloped, we can see where we are and reevaluate at that time, but currently we are still maintaining that.
All right, thank you, Joanne. I'm actually going to direct another question to you as well while we have you on. A question from Darren. Outreach on the 23rd Street South design was supposed to occur as part of the 223 23rd Street SPRC, since shelved. Will there be a replacement formal outreach on the design of 23rd Street South?
Again, this is Joanne. Because the 223 23rd Street project is on hold right now, we want to re-engage with the developer and see what their timeline is and see how that marries up with our timeline for the 23rd Street work. As I think most folks know, we had the 223 23rd Street project as part of the LRPC project that was occurred last fall. And so once we have a better idea of the timing of the development, we can reevaluate when and how that project moves forward.
Thanks, Joanne. A question from Anonymous, focused on Bell Street between 18th and 20th. They say it seems like a major gap in the proposed network. Street space is limited, but the sidewalks are quite wide. Have you considered the possibility of striping an interim bike lane within the sidewalk until redevelopment allows something better? Kevin, can you talk about the thought process with the review of that Bell Street segment?
Sorry, I keep losing the unmute button. So this section between 18th and 20th, I think, is slated as part of the sector plan to include bike lanes when those sections do redevelop. If there's any physical work that needs to be done with it, it's not something we've looked into. I can say that if there's the opportunity to stripe a temporary lane that does not require physical construction, it's something that we could look into.
let's see here. I see you guys are continuing to add more questions. I'm sorry, I'm doing my best to keep up here. There's a lot of moving pieces to.
Nate, I saw a question about bollards.
Ah, yes, let's do that. Question from, where was that? Oh, on option 4, Dana asks, will there be flex posts to keep cars out of the proposed facilities?
So the answer to that is yes in the short term, and in the long term, if our facilities work, then there can be much more substantial buffers between the parking vehicles and the bicyclists. So yes, the intent is to have the flexi posts.
Okay, thank you. Goodness. Thank you, Rob. I'm trying my best over here. Rob sent me a note that says not a question. You're doing okay. Okay. Let's see. That's done. We've dealt with that. Question from Garrett H. Can you talk more about, have I published this question? Oh goodness. Can you talk more about this proposed Clark Bell multi-use path? Is this a real proposal? What would it link to? I think I'm going to send that question up to Leah and Dan.
So I'll start. That is a real proposal that's in design right now.
Yeah, I was trying to find my mute button, but yes, it is real. I agree, Dan.
So it would link, I think it would link the intersection of 12th and Longbridge to the 15th Street corridor. Is that correct?
Yeah, so it links, like you said, Longbridge to 15th. So it ties down to the metro axis over there. Oh, sorry, down to 18th, actually. And then it also, at Longbridge, picks up at the, there's a trail connection that's going underneath the bridge that ties into the Army-Navy cycle track also.
Thank you, Kevin. I've gotten a couple of questions of further considerations for facilities south of 26th Street. So one here, and I apologize, my ad hoc note-taking and organizing of questions has swiftly come undone during this public meeting. I apologize, but we have some questions about, well, whether or not the Clark Bell south of 26th Street was evaluated for better bike facilities by eliminating the second general purpose lane, which would match the peak hour profile in the bus section. I think that question was from Darren. We had a similar question here. I think I've not brought it into my document, but for Clark Street from Rob Mandel, south of 23rd Street, the western side parking lane is not particularly efficient since there are so many curb cuts. Could this real estate be better used for perhaps a two-way facility on Clark? There's Darren's question. To follow up on the question about South Clark Street, 7-foot parking aisle on the west side. There aren't actually many functional spaces. Okay, all right. Those are the 23rd Street questions. I'm lumping them in together. Kevin and Dan, if you could speak to those.
Sure, there's a lot to unpack with that.
Yes.
Let me think of how to do that efficiently. I think these are good comments, and yes, we've considered, a lot of that. This doesn't mean that what is proposed is the only option in some of these areas. I think our discussion tonight has really been focused on the core area, where we're most constrained, and I think where most of the concerns are. Links to things that extend beyond that, will certainly delve into more deeply. To try to connect to facilities like that we just installed last year, like Potomac Avenue. So these are excellent comments. And yes, we're looking for more complete linkages all around.
And I think just to follow up on that from a planning standpoint, you know, the MTP bike element does outline some clear planning suggestions for south of 23rd Street, so that will obviously be taken into consideration as well.
Thanks, Leah. I just want to follow up on the Crystal Drive north of 18th. We got a couple further questions. Here's a phrase here. The response indicated that providing access to and from the Mount Vernon Trail for people on bikes using 15th and 18th Street is important. So why isn't that given priority over vehicle parking when it comes to that particular block? And Kevin, I know you dug into this a little bit.
Yes. So on that particular block between 15th and 18th, there are actually only a small amount of vehicle parking as part of the site that's just been developing there, and those spots are all inset to the sidewalk on the west side only. So there really isn't the space to remove and kind of reconfigure that section. I don't have the exact number off the top of my head, but I think the groupings of parking are really no longer than 3 spots consecutively, and it's kind of spaced along that full block, like 3 and 3 and 3.
Because that's the block that features the Hawk signal, correct?
Yes, the Hawk signal, and then also the RFB crossing. So everything south of where that RFB is, there is not any parking on the west side. And then at the Hawk signal, there's an extended area where there's nothing. And then, like I said, there's some, but a very limited amount of inset parking for short-term use. So
that's a good example of the limitations of our street mix graphics in our current presentation. And we're gonna, I think, have an additional visual that could perhaps better explain some of the constraints of that particular block later on in this public engagement process. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and share Darren's suggestion to invite folks to the SUSMO event to review the proposal and brainstorm improvements. We would love to have your comments and look forward to hearing the results of that meeting. I'm gonna close this out here because we're at 7:33. We've got 3 quick questions that I want to address that I think are important. I know we've gotten a lot of comments that are very detailed or sort of hewing towards the detailed side of things. So I'm going to bring it back with these last 3 questions that are a little bit broader, and then direct you guys to take some of that energy for detailed comments, detailed questions, and direct it towards the online feedback form, which I want to give Aaron a few minutes to walk us through. So 3 quick questions here. The first from Charlie: at 3 buses per hour, why can't the transit lane be shared with people on bikes? And I'm going to direct this question to Leah.
Yeah, thanks, Nate. I think, there's kind of 2 large parts to this. The first being funding. It was funding that came to be directed exactly towards transit and not necessarily bikes. But I think the other thing is kind of limitations for space or limitations in the right-of-way. I think a lot of people have been comparing this to the 14th Street pilot in DC. We don't have enough space to allow cyclists to kind of go around the buses when the buses stop. And I think the other thing to remember is that we're making this, a low stress bike route. So we're trying to have all users, use this route, be comfortable. And I don't think everyone would necessarily be comfortable using those bus lanes. We're not saying it's not allowed, it's not a possibility, that's to be determined, but we just want to make a low stress route that everyone is comfortable and safe riding.
Okay, thanks very much for that. Dana asks, what funding is available to accomplish these efforts? And I'll send that up to Dan and Leah as well.
So that's a good question. A lot of what we do in terms of improvements, bikes facilities are tied to our kind of roadway maintenance program. So that's, part of how we would execute some of this. We do have safety funding too that's available that could be used for a part of this as well. So there's a couple of programs that something like this would fit into. That said, of course, it's not its own separate capital project right now, so there are definite limitations to, how much could be done, and that's kind of why we kind of took that as that initial charge, is that time frame and that scope being, the primary factors that led us to this proposal that we're discussing now.
Okay. Thanks very much, Dan. A final question from Jeremiah. Will you be open to changes based on feedback from people? And with that, I'm going to direct that question to Aaron Potter. Aaron, the mute button.
Yeah, sorry. I had my finger on the share button, so I had to undo that. Anyway, yeah, so we are collecting feedback on this plan, and I want to go ahead and bring up the tool that we'll be using. I'll drop the link in the chat as an announcement after this, but so this is a Conveo tool. You might be familiar with it from working with some other Arlington County processes. For those of you who have been here with us today, some of this will be, this is sort of an explainer for folks who maybe weren't here or who want a little bit of a summarized information about what we're sort of proposing in this big picture, because I think we're getting a lot of detailed questions about the plan. Right now, we're sort of looking for feedback about sort of the general approach and how we're thinking about things, and wanted to share some of the challenges which the team has done. So there's all of these different steps that kind of walk through what the team members shared earlier. There's the text from the county board resolution, which is what we're trying to accomplish here. Links out to both the project page, which has a lot of this information, and we'll have this presentation as well up online. And then this also links out to the options explored and alternatives considered.
Hey, Aaron, I don't know that we got your screen on the live event quite yet.
Oh, how rude.
Send that to me real quick.
No, I think
it's coming up.
All right.
There we go.
Delightful. All right. Sorry, y'all. Here is a screen you should have been looking at while I was talking. So these are the steps, like I said, for folks who maybe are just needing more information or a refresher on what we talked about sort of here today. This is the county board resolution, alternatives, and then this is sort of where we're going to sort of ask for some questions to help us understand what kind of rider you are. And then opportunities to sort of share where your current challenge is. So this is a map feature and what could improve your biking experience at this location for your most challenging. And then if you've got any feedback or recommendations for the network, we're going to ask that you share them in there. So I will go ahead and copy this link. This will also go up on the project page, but not there just yet.
This is going in as an announcement. This will be the online feedback form, again, open until the end of the day on March 14th. And I want to assure folks whose questions were not directly addressed, we'll be copying all of the questions we received in this time. There are over 40, and I will assemble them into a document and publish those along with the presentation slides, and we'll post those on the project website. So with that, I want to thank everyone for joining us this evening. Thank you to our project team for presenting the recommendation, alternative number 4, and for taking questions today. We will be back with you after some time to review the feedback you'll submit on the online feedback form by March 14th at the end of the day. And we will share what we learned from your feedback and how we adjusted the plan in pursuit of a selection of a preferred alternative. If you guys have, if y'all have any questions about this engagement or about the recommended bike network, please go ahead and email staff, give us a ring. On the project page, you'll find the relevant folks' contact info. And I'm sure there are going to be a number of opportunities to provide comment with various committees and organizations as we work through the public engagement on this work. So thank you all very much for joining us this evening, and we'll hear from you soon.